Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for inviting me to speak before this really interesting experiment in deliberation. I've been asked to talk about the principles that might underlie the rights to vote in general, not just rights for immigrants, but as the basis for the rights to immigrants and citizens abroad. In general, that is not applying to particular sets of people, although we're going to look at how it applies to citizens abroad, and not in relation to presidential elections or any particular elections. I'm not going to get into that level of detail, though you could have arguments about that as well, but to go back to the fundamental principles. So I'm going to talk briefly about what citizenship implies or entails, and then look at a few different and conflicting, sometimes conflicting arguments for the grounds for voting rights for anybody in a democracy. We think people should vote in a democracy, but we need to know what are the reasons why people should have a right to vote in a democracy if we want to justify it. And we want to look at what's the most convincing argument for granting votes in a particular democracy, and whether this requires, as some people think, or rules out votes for citizens who are abroad. I'll then move on to specific objections to certain voting rights for citizens abroad and draw a few conclusions. So first of all, the question is whether citizenship means that you ought to vote, whether the citizenry and the demos, or the voting population, are identical and one and the same and ought to be, as some people assume. And they say, therefore, if citizens are to be equal, all should have an equal right to vote. However, citizenship is a very complex concept and practice and status. It involves a variable, developing over time, bundle of rights and duties. And those include the right to enter or return to the country, the right to diplomatic protection abroad, and being a symbol of full membership. And there are people who need those rights and deserve those rights who we don't give voting rights to, such as very young children, for example. So we can't simply say that citizens need to have votes. And we also, even in this, not even, but particularly in this country, we recognise there are many people who are not citizens who deserve votes, so that resident non-citizens, immigrants, get votes in local elections in Ireland more generously than in many other places. So there is no identity necessary between being a citizen and having a vote. So we have to step back again and ask the question, on what grounds then should people have votes if citizenship per se doesn't mean you have a vote? And why should a person have a vote in any particular state? And particularly in view of the fact that states are still territorially bounded. We live in separate states in the world, and broadly speaking, the writ of a government and the laws run within those territorial states principally. So there is a big question about what we should think about citizens who live outside the state. And we should note we're not just talking in this concern about emigrants, people who have left. We're talking about people who may have descended from citizens many generations ago and never visited or lived in the country at all, if we talk about citizens abroad in general. And we may be talking about people who find themselves on the other side of a border because of population movements or border changes or whatever. So citizens abroad for countries in general doesn't just mean emigrants of recent origin. So let's turn to the different arguments for granting voting rights in general. And I'm going to talk about 5, I think. The first one is the idea that, well, perhaps people who share national descent, common culture, national identity, or a sense of belonging should be given votes. And one argument for this is that it gives a sense of cohesion among the people who might share certain values and culture and so on, origin. On the other hand, it clearly excludes people who live in the country and who may be citizens who have a different descent, a different culture, and a different identity. And we've had all those discussions in Ireland over many years now. And it's not really regarded as a fully democratic basis for awarding votes. It excludes minorities, it excludes migrants and immigrants and so forth. And there may be other ways of recognising the importance of people who share our culture, identity and descent. Whether certificates of Irishness are the right way to do it is another question, but there may be other ways other than giving people votes. The second sort of set of answers, and I should say the ones I'm going to talk about now, are really live in contemporary democratic theory, because there are real debates about what are the fundamental principles on which people should be granted votes. In general, what democracy means. This isn't a resolved question. It's one that's debated now very actively among democratic theorists. So one approach is to say, making a contribution to the polity is a ground for giving somebody a vote. It's usually understood as an economic contribution in terms of taxation. This is the no taxation without representation argument. And this has the virtue that it recognises that a vote should depend on more than simply owning a passport, but on some contribution or involvement in the state, in the society. On the other hand, there's a real problem with this, apart from working out really what kind of contribution should really count, is that it excludes those who cannot contribute. What about children who are too young? What about people who are too old? What about people with serious disabilities and so on who cannot contribute economically? Now, we exclude children for other reasons, but we don't exclude older people, we don't exclude people with disabilities who may not be able to contribute economically, and for good reasons. On the other hand, it could include people who contribute through investments or through charitable contributions, but who have no connection with the country whatsoever. And on certain grounds, we wouldn't really want those people to determine the future of the country. So contribution to the polity alone is not clearly a good argument for a basis for votes, and it's not clear whether a political voice, rather than some kind of honour or recognition of other kind, is the appropriate reward for a contribution. So moving on from this, another perspective that has been offered very recently and is very popular and very valuable in certain kinds of ways, because it recognises that the effects of governments do spill across borders and that people in a globalised world are more connected in different kinds of ways. It says those who are affected by the laws and policies of the state ought to have a say in the decisions that are made. But the problem with this is that it can include everyone in the world ultimately, because the effects can take all kinds of forms and spread out in different kinds of ways. And we would need to be able to distinguish between the people who are really affected by something serious, such as, for example, if a nuclear power plant is dangerous just across the other side of the border, which might be threatened to be fatal for me, and some change that a government makes in some kind of commodity like that I want to buy in some other country, which is much less significant to my life interests. And people haven't really worked a way out of clearly distinguishing levels of affectedness to warrant giving people votes on the basis of being affected. However, it does maybe provide an argument for some kind of say, if not a full vote, for people to be consulted at least in matters that affect them. And we'd have to think about global institutions for this. But it doesn't, we've turned to citizens abroad, it doesn't provide any specific support for votes for citizens abroad, unless you can argue that citizens abroad are more affected than other people abroad by decisions that are made in our country. So, one that's been most powerful for most long is the idea that those who are subjected to the laws and policies of the state are those who should vote, because we are coerced by government and law. And it's held that coercion can only be legitimate if those who are coerced have a say in the laws that are made and can bring their governments to account. So that's really important. And it's also clear-cut. It applies to all residents within a territorial boundary who are subject to the laws. On the other hand, it's not quite perfect fit because it includes tourists and temporary visitors that we don't want to give votes to. It's good, though, also because it does include those resident non-citizens, those immigrants who are subject to the laws, and it can be the grounds for giving votes in local elections and so forth. So some people have argued that on this ground, not only should immigrants not have votes, but they absolutely should not be granted votes, and it would be undemocratic to give them votes because you're giving votes to people who are not going to take the consequences of the decisions that are made, who are not affected in this very serious sense of having the law coercing you, who are not affected by the decisions made. But it's been argued in response to that, citizens abroad are subject to some of the laws of the country. In particular, for example, they're subject to the laws about citizenship. If the domestic citizens suddenly decide to remove citizenship from anybody who left the country, that would really affect citizens abroad. So perhaps citizens abroad are subject in some sense. And some people abroad, like refugees who have left from extreme political persecution, are also subject to the laws of the state and coercion. So it could be that citizens abroad should be able to vote on some matters at least, but it doesn't really provide subjection, doesn't provide a strong warrant for them to vote on all matters. So a recent development from these theories is the idea of thinking of those who deserve to vote or given a vote are those who have a stake in the future of the state, who are stakeholders. And this is kind of a complex idea involving a kind of living in continuing interdependence with other citizens and having a long-term interest in the future of the state. Now, this is useful because it can recognize the reality of transnational citizens, people who have lived in one state but who've left but who keep up connections, perhaps. It's more clear-cut to apply than affectedness, but it's a bit less clear-cut to apply than subjection. And it's been argued that this, in recognition of the fact that a person can emigrate but keep up connections with the polity from which they've left and have certain lifelong interests, maybe going to return there and so forth, that could warrant granting a vote. Now, it's been argued, however, that this might allow but not require giving votes to citizens abroad. And it might not require or even support giving votes to any citizen abroad, like fourth-generation citizens abroad, but to citizens who have lived in the country, who have been subject and who may be subject again, and who have a long-term continuing interdependence with other citizens of that polity. But equally, it doesn't necessarily require an equal vote, and it may require some demonstration of commitment, like you could be asked to register or something on this basis. Now, I'm running out of time, and I won't really address, I think, the objections of double voting size and lack of knowledge, except to say that they can be overcome, and I think they'll be discussed by other people as well later on. But I would say that it's only a double vote if you have two votes in one election. Like if you had two votes in different countries for the European Parliament, that would be a problem. But if you have a vote, if you live in America, well, not America, if you live in another country and you have a vote in that Parliament or that legislature, and as an external citizen you have some kind of vote in Ireland, that would not count as double voting, because if you can genuinely have interests in two different countries. So I just move to my conclusions and say, if we can say that resident citizens are more comprehensively subject to the consequences of political decisions and have a greater stake in the future of the country, we might conclude that they should have a greater say than external citizens. But if citizens abroad are subject in certain respects and may have a long-term, lifelong stake in the future of the country, they should have some say. There may be no inherent right to a vote of equal weight for citizens abroad, but there seem to be some good grounds for giving votes of some kind to them if they have lifelong interconnection with the polity and in a way that doesn't swamp the citizen vote, which is possible to do. And I'm suggesting that the arguments so far seem to suggest that the arguments on the basis of subjection and stakeholding are more useful, more valid in relation to grounding democratic theory, but they still have to be worked out in actually how they apply to whether you should grant votes to citizens abroad. Thanks very much.